New York City, 1883. The office of Frank Harris was less a room than a throne. Dark walnut paneling swallowed the light. A map of the United States stretched across one wall, stitched with red pins and blue lines, railroad routes carving the land like veins. At the center of it all sat Frank, a man more iron than blood, and behind his desk was a silence forged by decades of power. John stood opposite him, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders square, chin lifted in defiance he didn't fully feel. "You'll marry her," Frank said, not lifting his eyes from the telegram he'd just signed. The words hit with the weight of a gavel. Final. Unflinching. John blinked, the air in the room suddenly too thick. "I beg your pardon?" Frank looked up slowly, as though he'd expected resistance and found it tiresome. "Grace Carson, Wyoming Territory. She owns land we need. You need discipline. The arrangement benefits you both." John laughed, but it was hollow. He turned to the frost-bitten window, watching the fog rise over the East River. "You're arranging my life like a land merger." "I'm rescuing it," Frank replied. "What you've done with it so far borders on waste." He stood, walking with calm precision to the drinks cart, pouring a single measure of scotch. No offer for John. That had always been his style, provision without generosity. "You left the Kingsley deal unfinished, ignored Davenport's expansion plans, and you broke off an engagement to the only woman who could have salvaged your social standing." John's voice came low and sharp. "Because I don't love Clara." Frank turned slowly, glass in hand. "Love is a luxury. Legacy is obligation." John's fingers curled at his side. He thought of boardrooms where no one listened, of Clara's cold kisses and colder stares, of his own life, tailored suits, empty promises, and a father who praised track mileage more than his own son's ambition. And this girl, this farmer, is drowning in debt, but she has land, 70 acres, fertile. And I'm your trade. Frank took a sip of scotch. "You'll leave next week. Marry her, work the land, prove you can build something without my help." "And if I say no?" The question hung in the room like smoke. Frank met his eyes. No anger, just finality. "Then you walk out with your name and nothing else. No trust, no title, no stake in the company. You'll be just another man, tall, handsome, broke, and forgettable." The clock ticked behind them. Somewhere outside, a carriage wheel screeched on stone. John closed his eyes for one long second. When he opened them, he saw not his father, but the man who'd raised him like a ledger entry. "If I leave, I lose everything. If I stay, I become nothing. But maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, I can become someone new." He turned to the door. "When do I leave?" Frank smiled faintly, not with joy, with victory. "Sunday." And just like that, the heir of the Harris name became a farmhand in exile. Not for punishment, for possibility. Wyoming Territory, late autumn, 1883. The wind came first, cold, dry, sweeping across the plains like a messenger. It rattled the loose boards of the station house and carried with it the sharp scent of prairie grass and horses left too long in the sun. When the train finally arrived, it did so with a shriek of iron and steam, exhaling city breath into a world that didn't want it. Grace Carson stood beside her wagon, arms crossed, boots planted firm in the dirt. She had been waiting for 20 minutes and expecting disappointment for 10 years. She watched as the passengers spilled out. Businessmen with creased collars, one tired woman with a baby, a boy dragging a crate of chickens. Then came him, tall, trim, black coat too fine for dust. Eyes scanning like he didn't see much worth seeing. "You John Harris?" she asked, voice clipped as her hat brim shadowed her eyes. He stopped, suitcase in hand. I am. She didn't offer a hand. Load up. Sun's dropping. They rode in silence. The wagon creaked over hard-packed earth, the wheels catching every stone like it had a score to settle. Grace held the reins with practiced ease. Beside her, John sat like a man trying not to wrinkle his pride. He glanced at her once. High cheekbones, wind-chapped lips, a jaw set like granite. This was not a woman who waited for things to happen. She made them happen, or she buried them. I expected a letter, he said finally. Didn't write one. Any reason? Didn't want to. That ended the conversation. By the time they reached the homestead, the sky was bruising into twilight. The land rolled in gentle waves, dust and gold, stitched together by fences that sagged with time. The barn leaned west. The house stood narrow and tall, as though trying to be more than it was. John stepped down from the wagon and stared. This was it. His new empire. A place where the wind outranked him and the dirt didn't care. Inside, the house smelled of pine soap and something faintly sweet, like dried apples and old memory. Herbs hung from the rafters. A single photograph sat on the mantel, Grace as a girl, beside a man with sunken eyes and one hand resting on her shoulder. She didn't explain it. He didn't ask. She handed him a cup of water and pointed to the hallway. Room's at the end. And yours? Across from it. A pause. This isn't a honeymoon. Didn't think it was. That night after the lamps went out, John lay on a bed that creaked with every breath. Through the thin walls, he heard the floorboards groan beneath her steps. Then stillness. He stared at the ceiling and thought of velvet chairs, of city windows and highball glasses, of Clara Kingsley's calculated smile. And then he thought of Grace's hands on the reins, firm, unflinching. Maybe the West isn't exile. Maybe it's trial by fire. And maybe, just maybe, he'd come out of it more than what he'd been. 2 mornings later, the wind settled long enough for the vows to take root. The church was no cathedral, just 4 whitewashed walls and a steeple that leaned east with age. Inside, the pews were half filled with townsfolk who'd come out more for the novelty than the blessing. Grace wore a dress the color of oat husks, plain, pressed, the same one she'd worn the last time she buried a family mule. Her braid was tighter than usual, her eyes sharper. John stood beside her in a suit that still smelled faintly of train smoke. His tie was crooked. He hadn't noticed. He hadn't looked in a mirror since Cheyenne. The preacher was a man of few teeth and fewer words. His voice scratched the air like a field crow. "We gather here today," he began, and the words floated like dust in light. Caleb, the orphaned boy Grace had taken in last winter, sat on the front pew swinging his legs. He clutched a lopsided bouquet he'd picked himself. Goldenrod, thistle, and a sprig of mint. "Do you, John Harris, take this woman, Grace Carson, to be your wife, lawfully and faithfully, till death parts you?" John glanced sideways. Grace stared straight ahead. "This isn't how I imagined it," he thought. "But it's the first thing I've chosen freely." "I do," he said. "And do you, Grace Carson? Take this man." "I do." She didn't let him finish. There was no kiss, no music, just the closing of a Bible and the creak of the preacher's knees as he stepped down. Outside, the sun had climbed, but the wind remained sharp. Townsfolk offered nods, half smiles, handshakes that ended too quickly. No ribbons, no celebration. John helped Grace onto the wagon. "You sure about this?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just looked out at the road. "You're not what I asked for," she said. "But you're what I got. I don't turn away things that try." Back at the house, the front door stuck like always. John pushed it open with one shoulder. The silence inside felt different now, not empty, just waiting. On the kitchen table, the marriage certificate sat unsigned, save for the preacher and the storekeeper, who had borne witness. A pen lay beside it. Grace picked it up, scrawled her name first, handed it over. "Your turn." He signed. Not because he believed in the words, but because she did. That night the house made its usual sounds, shifting timbers, coyotes howling somewhere past the creek, wind pressing against the shutters like a man looking for a place to rest. John lay awake on one side of the house, Grace on the other. Neither of them slept quickly. And both of them, though they would never admit it, felt something unspoken growing in the dark. The days that followed moved like cold molasses. Quiet, slow, thick with something neither of them knew how to name. John worked, badly at first. He drove the wrong fence posts, overfed the goats, dropped a whole sack of seed into the well bucket before realizing it wasn't a grain bin. Grace never scolded, but she didn't praise him either. One afternoon he collapsed on the barn threshold, panting, shirt clinging to his back, hands raw. Grace handed him a tin mug of water. "You're bleeding through your gloves." "I noticed." She knelt beside him, took his hand without warning. Her fingers, firm, calloused, competent, turned his palm upward. "Blisters tear if you grip too hard. Let the tool do some of the work. Hard to share the load when you don't trust the partner." Grace didn't look at him, but her thumb paused just slightly at the base of his fingers. Then she stood. "The mule's limping. We'll need to trade him before winter." And just like that, she was gone again. That evening the wind shifted. Grace stepped outside and sniffed the air. Dust curled along the hills. The sky turned strange, low and orange, like a wick burning toward something terrible. "Storm's coming," she muttered. She didn't shout it, didn't need to. John was already gathering lanterns. The first crack of thunder split the sky like bone. Rain slammed sideways against the house, thick as thrown gravel. The barn door ripped loose. John sprinted out before she could stop him, shirt plastered to his back. "The calf!" she yelled, just as he vanished into the curtain of water. He found it half tangled in barbed wire near the south paddock. It bleated, scared, bleeding. He looped rope around it, slipping in mud, barely managing to haul both of them upright. Grace appeared through the downpour, like a figure in a fever dream, hair soaked, dress twisted at the waist. Together, they dragged the calf into the barn, slammed the door behind them. They collapsed into the hay, soaked, muddy, breathing hard. Neither spoke. Rain pounded the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Grace leaned back, eyes closed. "You're stupid," she said. "Probably." She opened her eyes, looked at him. "But you didn't run." He met her gaze, equal parts fury and softness. Not this time. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric. Grace's chest rose and fell slowly. Her braid had come undone. Strands clung to her neck like wild vines. John watched her, heartbeat like a drum in a canyon. But he didn't move. Neither did she. Because something between them had shifted. Not fixed, not forgiven, but recognized. And that was a beginning. The storm broke something open. Not in the barn, not in the fences or the roof. In them. The next morning, the air hung wet and quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Chickens wandered the yard in silent communion with puddles. The sun tried weakly to break through the clouds. Grace emerged first. Her boots squelched in the softened ground. She walked the fence line, eyes scanning damage, lips pressed to a thin line. John joined her with 2 mugs of coffee, his second attempt at brewing. This one wasn't terrible. "Fence needs 4 new posts," she said without looking at him. "We'll do it together," he answered. And that word, together, hung there longer than it needed to. The days that followed weren't easier, but they were quieter, shared. She taught him how to judge the weight of soil in his palm. He fixed the barn pulley that had jammed for 2 years. He noticed she hummed while washing dishes. She learned he whistled when anxious. One morning, she found a bundle of firewood neatly stacked beside the door. She didn't ask if it was him. That night, a tin of biscuits appeared on the windowsill near his bed. Neither said anything, but they both noticed. One afternoon, they repaired the old chicken coop. She balanced a board over the top. He steadied it from below. Their hands met, held. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. "You're learning," she said softly. "You're teaching," he replied. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Later in town, they passed the baker's boy who waved at Grace with sticky fingers. She waved back. The woman at the dry goods store called her Mrs. Harris for the first time. Grace flinched, but not from displeasure, from surprise. That evening they sat on the porch while dusk settled like dust. Caleb curled at their feet with his dog and a book he couldn't quite read. Grace braided her hair. John watched the wind move the wheat like water. "Why'd you agree to this?" he asked. She didn't look at him right away. "Because my father was dying. Because the bank was knocking. Because the land doesn't care if you cry." "Do you regret it?" She turned now, met his eyes. "Not today." And for the first time since he arrived, John felt the ground beneath his feet hold steady. They heard him before they saw him. A carriage, too fine for Wyoming dirt, creaked its indignation all the way up the Carson path. Horses snorted against the harness, and the wheels left clean, even ruts through the muddy yard. Grace stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on a rag. John emerged from the barn, sleeves rolled, shirt open at the neck, hair damp with sweat and sun. The carriage stopped. Out stepped Frank Harris, black overcoat buttoned to the throat, cane in one hand, disapproval in the other, like winter had arrived early just to follow him in. "Father," John said. Frank surveyed the house like a man inspecting damage after a fire. His gaze swept from the bent porch rail to the patched windows, to Grace standing firm at the top step. "You've been playing settler, I see." "I've been building something, with my hands. A poor return on investment." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Inside, the air thickened. Frank declined coffee, declined to sit, stood instead like a judge in someone else's courtroom. "I came to offer you a chance to walk back the mistake." John folded his arms. "You mean Grace. I mean this performance, this farce. The board will reinstate your seat. Kingsley is still open to a union. One apology clears the slate." John glanced at Grace, who stood at the window now, her back to them, arms folded. "And if I stay?" "Then you stay a poor man, anonymous, forgotten." Silence. Then John walked slowly to the hearth, where Grace had hung her father's photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. The old man's eyes stared back, tired but sure. "You said I needed discipline," he said quietly. "You were right." He turned to face Frank. "But I didn't find it in boardrooms or balance sheets. I found it in fences, in sore hands, in her." Frank's eyes narrowed. "You found a woman to hide behind." John stepped forward, calm, firm. "No. I found someone strong enough not to run." Frank finally turned to Grace, truly looked at her, as if seeing her not just as a name on paper, but as a consequence of his own making. "You knew what this was," he said, voice even. Grace didn't flinch. "I did," she answered. John turned to her, confused. "What does he mean?" She hesitated, then spoke. Not ashamed, just honest. "My father left more than a field behind when he died. There was debt, more than I could shoulder. Your father came with an offer, not kindness, not rescue, just terms." John's voice was quiet. And you agreed? Grace looked at him fully. I did, because I had no choice then. A pause. But what I choose now, that's different. Frank studied them both, John, steadier than he'd ever been in any boardroom, and Grace, unflinching. Something in his expression shifted, not approval, but understanding perhaps. He looked at John's calloused hands, at the photograph by the hearth, at the woman who refused to yield. Then slowly he tipped his hat. So be it, he said, not with anger, but with something quieter. And he walked out. The carriage rattled away, fading like thunder after a storm. Grace and John stood alone in the silence that followed, changed, not by what they chose, but by what they refused to surrender. The morning after Frank left, the air felt different, lighter, but not easier. Grace stood in the kitchen, slicing bread with the slow care of someone lost in thought. John was out front, repairing the last gate Frank's carriage had loosened. Neither had spoken much since the revelation. Some truths, even when they explain everything, still sit heavy on the chest. Later that day, John found her in the barn, brushing down the old mule. Its coat was patchy with age, its ribs softened by time and care. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, watching. You've carried more than your share, he said quietly. She didn't turn. So have you. A pause. The mule flicked its ears. Then she set the brush aside, resting a hand on the railing. What are we supposed to be now? John stepped closer, his voice low. Not strangers, not anymore. She gave a small nod, gaze still lowered. But it doesn't feel simple. He reached out, letting his fingers brush her sleeve. Then we start with this. 2 people who didn't turn away. That evening the town hosted its fall gathering. A few lanterns strung through the trees, pie contests, a fiddler who only knew 3 songs but played them like hymns. Grace didn't want to go, but Caleb begged, and John asked. She wore the same blue dress. No jewelry, no ribbons, just her. He wore a shirt she'd mended. His hands were clean, his hair combed. They danced once, then again. They laughed at nothing, ate everything, stood in the corner when the music slowed. At the edge of the field behind the church, beneath stars too clear to lie, John finally turned to her. I stayed because I had to, he said, but I'm staying now because I want to. She looked up, unsure. Even with all of it. He reached for her hand. Calloused met calloused, especially with all of it. He leaned in first. The kiss wasn't dramatic, it was real. 2 people, cracked and softened, choosing the hard thing, the right thing, each other. John never returned to the East, never sought his name carved into railroads or maps. His legacy took root in soil, not steel. Grace never left the farm, but she grew into something louder than silence, brighter than sacrifice. Together, they built more than a home. They built something that lasted, because love, when it's earned, doesn't need permission, just courage and choice.